Hello, everybody. I'm Val Jenness. I'm the Dean of the School of Social Ecology. Boy, I almost forgot what school I was from there. It's just a weird brain glitch. It really is a pleasure to be here this afternoon and to welcome you all to this event. The event was advertised, as you see up on the overhead, as The Many Faces of the Justice System, Victims, Offenders, and the Wrongfully Accused. And that's a great title, but I would like to say we could just as easily describe this as an event that gives us a closer look at the exciting research being conducted by the UCI Center for Law and Psychology and all of its affiliates across multiple schools. So I'm going to give it two titles right out of the gates. Today, this event is sponsored by the Newkirk Center, as well as the Center for Psychology and Law. And I want to begin by recognizing the founding director of the Center for Psychology and Law, who's also going to be on the panel today, distinguished Professor Beth Loftus. And I know most of you know who Beth is, but I want to make sure that she gets a little credit for founding this center and getting us rolling. Beth, if you could just raise your hand. And,
thank you, Val.
All right. I want to also say that under Professor Loftus's direction, she began this center and she's installed a number of initiatives across campus. One that I just want to mention today and invite you all to attend as it unfolds is what we call our Science to Fight Injustice lecture series, in which we try to highlight the many injustices in the American justice system, injustices that we all know have tragic consequences for innocent people and those who care about them, that involve millions and millions of taxpayer dollars, and I think most importantly are at odds with the promise of a just justice system. This series, The Science to Fight Injustice, looks at these issues from a variety of angles. And if you came today interested in the issues that the panelists will talk about, I'm sure you'll be interested in this series as well. This series is now in its third year, and it has what we in administration call legs because it's been institutionalized, and it's really popular both internal to the campus as well as externally. Now, Beth got us rolling in the Center for Psychology and Law, and we have a new director, Professor Beth Kaufman, and I don't know where Beth Kaufman went. Here we go. Just people know who you are. She'll be a panelist today as well. As I say, I have too many Beths in my life. There's Beth Loftus, there's Beth Kaufman. Beth recently took over the duties of directing the center, and in predictable fashion, she brings new energy and new ideas and a dogged commitment to elevating the center to the next level of excellence as we try to promote the interdisciplinary study of law here at the University of California, Irvine. In the short time she's been the director, she's installed a brown bag series that introduces faculty and staff and guest speakers to the campus, both near and far, so we'll try to push those out in case any of you would like to attend any of those. I think about a month ago, she had what she called Rap on Trial, which was a highly successful event that featured the work being done by faculty from the School of Law, from the School of Social Ecology, and the School of Humanities, really once again showcasing the value of interdisciplinarity as we interrogate the workings of the law. This event was a huge success on many fronts, but from my point of view as an administrator, one of the successes was that it served to cement a commitment to working across schools and really showcasing how we can come together to think in ways that perhaps we couldn't if we otherwise didn't come together. Beth is also working hard to invite and include the community into the work that the center is doing, and I'm really pleased to see Maria Hernandez is here today. Where's Maria? Just a little hand wave there. I should actually say Judge Hernandez is in attendance. She's a social ecology graduate, and she's the presiding judge of the juvenile court for Orange County. I can't quite see her in those terms yet, because when I first met her, she was trying to push me out of the wine line at another salon. So I'm going to have to get used to calling you judge versus wine hoarder.
I go with wine hoarder.
Wine hoarder, okay. She's really been wonderful. She's shown up at a couple of our events, and we have great plans to collaborate with the judge and people like her in Orange County to make good on the promise to make the work we do here at the University of California matter in our communities. I'm also pleased to see that we have so many of you in the room today that are interested in the issues that we're going to be talking about. And one final recognition, I want to thank Dean Chermerinsky, the Dean of the Law School here at UCI, for once again collaborating and partnering with us in the School of Social Ecology to advance what we share as a commitment to working across the two schools to really understand the law in multiple ways. So, Erwin, once again, thank you for showing up to these events and helping us advance it. I've been asked to introduce all of the speakers, and since there's 5 speakers, I can't do justice to any one of them. What I decided to do was give you just a little flavor of where they come from on campus, what they study, and just a little sense of how they make what they do matter in the world. So let me start with Elizabeth Kaufman, who's professor of psychology and social behavior. She also has appointments in the School of Education and Law, and her research focuses on the nexus between human development, adolescence, and the criminal justice system. She's particularly interested in understanding how development intersects with the way we do and don't treat our youth once they get entangled in our system. Her work's informed a lot of public policy decisions, including Supreme Court decisions on how and whether and why we should or should not execute our youth, and how we should or shouldn't think about paroling our youth. We also have Jody Quaz, who's a professor of psychology and social behavior. And for many of you know Jody from her work also in the county, but in the literature. Her research is on memory development in children and children's involvement in the legal system. She has a lot of research on things like how accurately and reliably children can recall memories to report them once involved in the system, the effects of stress on children's memories, emotion regulation, and physiological reactivity as predictors of how children cope with trauma and report those events later, jurors' perceptions of child witnesses, and just in general, the consequences of legal involvement for child witnesses in our system. I want to pause because I purposely introduced Beth and Jody first because a couple weeks ago I was at the OC Court Commission meeting and something that deans just love happened. The presiding judge, it was not Maria at the time, walked in and said he wanted to attend this meeting because he wanted to say out loud that both Jody and Beth were doing stellar work in the community, not just as researchers, but as public servants that reach out and engage with the system in ways that reflect our shared commitment to ensuring the system works the way we think it should and could. So for me, that was a wonderful example of our top-notch researchers in the community making a difference in an institution that affects all of us. We also have on the panel today Elizabeth Loftus, who's a distinguished professor of social ecology with appointments in criminology, law, and society, as well as psychology and social behavior and cognitive sciences. Many of you know her focus is, of course, on human memory. If you saw her recent TEDx talk, which went viral, I don't know how many millions of hits it has now, I love her line where she says, "I study not how people forget things, but I study how people remember things that never happened." That just summarized about a 30, 40-year career in one sentence. Her experiments reveal that facts, ideas, suggestions, and other post-event information can modify our memories and affect how we recall, and report. Armed with her own research and the research of many others, she's been an expert witness in some of the most high-profile cases in the United States that rely upon memory. And I would add, a lot of people don't know this about her, as well as some of the most low-profile cases that you've never heard of. Whenever I ask Beth, well, why are you working on that case? It'll be a case I've never heard of. She'll say the same thing every time. Well, it's just not right. It's just not just. It's just this person needs some help. And that always moves me, sometimes way more than when I hear she's working on Michael Jackson or Martha Stewart or all the other cases. We also have with us today Professor Pete Ditto, who's a professor in psychology and social behavior. Pete studies the role of motivation, emotion, and intuition in social, political, moral, medical, and legal judgments. His recent work has focused on how people think about moral issues, especially in a highly partisan context, and how they use general principles to apply to particular decisions informed by their beliefs about morality and politics. The wonderful thing about Pete's work is that he turns on its head the notion that seeing is believing, and he always reminds me that believing can be seeing as well. And I always take that lesson from Pete's work. Those of us that know Pete, and you'll see here today when he presents, there's a good reason he's an award-winning teacher on this campus, because he gives great talks, and he's recognized as knowing how to bring information to audiences of all different levels. Finally, from the UCI School of Law, we have Benjamin Van Roy. And where's Benjamin? There he is. And he's the John S. and Marilyn Long Professor of U.S.-China Business and Law and the Academic Director of the John S. and Marilyn Long U.S.-China Institute for Business and Law. Well, you have to give people credit, right? His research focuses on the implementation of law in a comparative perspective, including China and other places. Since 2000, he studied the implementability, and I had to rehearse that word, the implementability of legislation, the regulatory practices around law enforcement, and how and why it is we do and don't comply with rules and regulations and laws. It's a fascinating area of research in which he brings to bear a whole bunch of disciplines: the sociology of law, criminology, political science, social psychology, and he uses anthropological methods. He truly is the interdisciplinary scholar. as he tries to approach larger issues about compliance and behavior, both in public and private enforcement practices. Now, like all the other panelists, he too moves his work outside into the non-academic world, has a long history of doing work that matters. I will just cite, for example, that he's been an advisor to the Prime Minister of Denmark. That struck me as pretty impressive. Maybe you'll tell us what you told the Prime Minister, all right? After these speakers provide very brief comments, I think they're going to be asked to keep it to 10 to 12 minutes. My colleague and fellow dean and friend Erwin Chermerinsky will provide some closing comments. Now, all of you, I think, know Erwin is the dean of the School of Law here at UCI, and it's easy to introduce him. He's quite literally a famous constitutional law scholar, so that's an easy introduction. How do I know this to be true? Well, I'm an empirical person. I look for evidence. Turns out whenever I'm traveling and I get to talking to someone on a plane and I tell them I'm from UCI, it's quite often the case they'll say, isn't that where that Erwin Chermerinsky guy is? And I always say, yes, it is, and then I brag about knowing him. And if I do that well, I can get an aisle seat when I was assigned a window seat. I can get a lot of benefits. I'm always reminded in those moments of how fortunate we are to have Dean Chermerinsky here at UCI, because he does the work day in, day out to facilitate these kinds of programs, and he brings great stature to the university. I will say it's appropriate that Erwin go last, because those of us in the public speaking business, we all know you don't want to go after Erwin. So he's always last on the panel. All right, with that started, I will turn it over to Professor Beth Kaufman to get us going.
Well, hello and welcome. I'm Beth Kaufman. First, thank you all for coming. It's so nice to see so many faces in the audience. And of course, I cannot begin my presentation without thanking our dean, Dean Valerie Jenness. Without her support, her dedication, her tireless efforts, this center would not be functioning and doing nearly as well as we are. We are indebted to her for making this possible. So a huge thank you to Val. And I'm delighted to be here today to talk to you about my research. I'm a developmental psychologist, and my research focuses on the intersection between adolescent development and juvenile justice. And thus, I hope for those of you who are TV fans, you might appreciate my title of Arrested Development. But I thought I'd start by telling you a few stories. And the first story I want to tell you about is a little boy, 12 years old. His name is Paul Gingrich. And in 2010, Paul Gingrich and his 15-year-old friend, Colt Lundy, decided to murder Colt Lundy's stepfather. Now, Colt Lundy was being abused by his stepfather, had coerced Paul to help him. Paul, sitting next to Colt with a gun, waiting on the couch, next to Colt saying, I don't think this is a good idea, I don't think this is a good idea. Colt's stepfather burst through the door, obviously very angry seeing the two boys with the gun. They opened fire. Of course, when Paul opened fire, both shots ricochet. One does hit Colt's stepfather, but they weren't the murdering blows. Unfortunately, both boys were tried as adults. Both boys were given 25 to 30-year sentences. And now we have a 12-year-old lifer sitting in jail for a conspiracy to commit murder, even though he was 12 years old at the time. And as you're going to hear later today, do we even know whether he was competent to stand trial? So I'm going to be talking to you about some of these adolescent issues. But before I go on to tell you about some of the data, I think it's important to tell you some of the other things that have been happening around the country. This happened in 2010. Also in 2010, how many of you have ever done something you kind of regret doing during your adolescence? And please don't raise your hand. Maybe you threw a spitball, and that spitball may have hit somebody. Well, in fact, that's exactly what Andrew Mickle did, an honors student, ROTC student, planning to attend the U.S. Naval Academy when he graduated from high school. But as a freshman, sitting in the lunchroom, he thought it'd be fun to unscrew the ballpoint pen, put some pellets in, and shoot across the room. Well, of course, they did hit somebody. They did create red marks on the person's body. Well, Paul was suspended for 10 days. Rightly so, he'd done something he shouldn't have done. But then, zero tolerance policies. That didn't seem extreme enough, so he was expelled for 1 year. And then that didn't seem serious enough. He was then charged with assault, is now given a criminal record, and his dreams of attending the U.S. Naval Academy are now gone. So we've taken an honors student with no prior record, given him a criminal record, and now destroyed his future career plans. To even push this a little further, for those of you with adolescents, technology has somewhat changed the way adolescents engage with one another. For instance, sexting. And that's when you get those very interesting photos on your phone. For those of you who do this, if you receive those photos and they are of a person under the age of 18, that's also considered child pornography, even if the two of you engaged and agreed to do that together. For instance, in a case AH v. Florida, a 16-year-old girl and a 17-year-old boy engaged in a sexual act. And in fact, they didn't even share this photo with anybody. It was just on their phone and was observed. Because somebody found this photo on their phone, it was not sent, but somebody found it, they then decided to charge them with child pornography. They've now been charged with child pornography, now have criminal records, and of course, are subject to possibly registering as sex offenders under Megan's Law for the next 25 years. So, we also know adults don't always make great decisions. We also know this could happen at any age. But thinking about these types of situations, and if you don't know, this is Andrew Weiner. But anyway, the 12-year-old sentenced to life in prison. You have 9th graders kicked out of school for a spitball. And you have text messages considered child pornography. This is actually where my research focuses on, and the fundamental question that my research focuses on. Are adolescents different from adults in ways that would require different treatment under the law? And if so, how would you even consider these developmental factors? And where should you even draw the line between childhood and adulthood? Where is the right line? What should the law be doing? And this is where my research now focuses. And often what happens is I get phone calls from reporters all the time dealing with these very cases. Well, why would an adolescent do that? Adolescents know the difference between right and wrong. A 5-year-old knows the difference between right and wrong. Your ability to control that versus your ability to know that is really where my research focuses on, because adolescents aren't stupid. In fact, adolescent development, and during this adolescent period, is when we see the most growth in cognitive ability. Kids are able to take other people's perspective, to think abstractly, and for those of you with children, they can argue very effectively. So, this becomes the paradox. If adolescents are so smart, why do they do such very stupid things? And this is what my colleagues and I have been working on. I've been part of a MacArthur Foundation research network on adolescent development and juvenile justice. And we had the opportunity to do a large-scale study to address this very question. And what we did was we looked at both their intellectual ability as well as their emotional maturity. And here is what we found. At around age 16 years, you can see that adolescents look equivalent to adults in their cognitive functioning. Now, this might be very important when you think about other types of decision, like medical decision-making, in terms of school decision-making for classes. But other development still is going on. No parent would say, well, this kid's now an adult at 16. So what else is happening? This is where we looked at what we call maturity or psychosocial development. And as you can see, that continues to develop well into the age of 25. So we have this cognitive system and this emotional system. And the two of them do not develop in tandem. The cognitive system develops sooner than the emotional system. The best way that I've learned to talk about this is by saying it's like starting the engine without a skilled driver. The car works, the engine runs, but the person behind the wheel can't control the car. So kids have the cognitive tools. They know the difference between right and wrong, but they just don't have the emotional ability to control that. So when you ask an adolescent, why did you do that? And they say, I don't know. They're actually telling you the truth because they knew that they shouldn't, but they just couldn't stop themselves. And in fact, we have data to show that this is why we see the disconnect between what kids know and what kids do. And a lot of this research has to do with the advance in the area of neuroimaging, and in particular in the area of the frontal lobe. Now that's the area right behind your forehead, the frontal lobe of the brain. We call it sort of the CEO of the company. It runs the way we control our impulses, our planning, our gut intuitions. It's basically the boss. Well, that part of the brain is not fully developed until around age 25. And yet that's the part of the brain that controls those emotional control systems. So we actually have evidence to now help us better understand why cognitively kids could know things, but emotionally they can't control them. The part of the brain that's responsible for that emotional control is still developing. So then, young man, go to your room and stay there until your cerebral cortex matures. Thank goodness for New Yorker cartoons. Because this is exactly what we're starting to see. That do we need to wait for kids to grow up? And in fact, when we start to take this research into the courtroom, one of the things that we're seeing is that what do kids know and how does this work in the courtroom setting? And in fact, this was part of a large-scale study we did with the MacArthur Network on their competence. And we did this in 4 locations with adolescents and adults who were both in the community, having never had a record, and those who were incarcerated, who were in detention facilities. It was over 1,300 participants. And what's most important to note is that we used a cognitive assessment tool to look at competence to stand trial. This is what many judges and attorneys use to evaluate competence. Is this person competent? Do they meet the Dusky standard for competence? It gets to 3 areas: understanding, reasoning, and appreciation. I'll be focusing solely on the outcomes of understanding and reasoning today. And the bottom line answer is, we have kids, 15 and younger, who do not understand what's happening in the courtroom. And in fact, you can see nearly a third of those 11 to 13-year-olds and about a fifth of the 14 to 15-year-olds are not competent to stand trial. It's important to note, though, look at that line, around 16 and older. Again, we saw those cognitive capacities. They seem equivalent to adults. Now, notice I didn't say as smart as adults or better than adults, because notice we did have some adults who were not competent to stand trial. But kids are more vulnerable. They are less likely to be able to understand what's happening in the courtroom. Now, when I show you these data, folks say, well, but kids who've been in the system before, they've been through this before, they'd have expertise. They would be more aware of what a judge does or what an attorney does. Well, in fact, we split this out by our community kids and our incarcerated kids. And here's what we find. For the community kids, that same pattern, those 14, 15, and younger, not competent to stand trial. Now, the detained kids are being pink. I'll let you all try to guess, will they be better or worse? Everybody place your votes. And the answer is they're actually worse. And the reason being is that when you actually go in and do IQ assessments of kids in the justice system, and this is also true for adults, the average IQ is around 85. That's about 1 full standard deviation from the mean, which is 100. So, and 100 is average. That's your C student. So we're looking at kids who have a lower deficit, who are more vulnerable, and these are the very kids we're putting into the system with the least understanding of what the system is doing. So as I conclude, as I only have 10 to 12 minutes, and I hope I've gotten interest in the area of what we're doing here at UCI, I'd like you to think about Paul Gingrich, who I spoke about earlier. Realize he's 12 years old, and a juvenile who can be tried and sentenced as an adult. He couldn't get a job at McDonald's. He wouldn't be allowed to buy a pack of cigarettes. Forget getting a cocktail. Rent a car. Rental agencies have known for years the age should be 25 to release a car to anybody. And he would not be allowed to vote. It's most important to remember adolescents are not miniature adults, and the legal system does have a responsibility to understand who these kids are and how we treat them. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Beth. Thank you, Dean Jenness. And thank you all for coming this evening. So I'm actually gonna take a turn. We're gonna actually move down in age from Dr. Kaufman's work and talk about children and how best to interview suspected victims of abuse. Now, I want to start with kind of just an overview of what's happened during the past several decades. Literally hundreds of studies have been conducted, testing children's ability to recount prior experiences, their eyewitness capabilities, most noteworthy in the domain of children's suggestibility. Now, the nice thing is I can summarize this entire body of work in one sentence. So the summary is that the results of this work demonstrate quite provocatively that children can be manipulated into making all sorts of errors, including claiming that entirely false events occurred. Now, these errors are tremendously important, and one of the significant impacts of this line of work is really to understand what appears to have happened in some of the most egregious cases of child abuse that we have seen in modern era. And in these cases, scores of children claimed to have been abused, most often at the hands of their daycare providers. Their claims included bizarre, impossible components, and yet no physical evidence was ever uncovered. Now, in essence, what this research has done is this research has demonstrated what's believed to have occurred in these cases, that children can be led to make false allegations of abuse. Now, what I want to talk about today is that false allegations aren't the only type of error that children can make. There's another type of error, and this other type of error is false denials. Now, some of you might be wondering, okay, do false denials really occur? And the answer is that they actually occur far more frequently than false allegations. So let me just give you a couple of examples of how often these false denials of abuse occur. So among children who actually show up at a pediatrician's office and they present with no signs of abuse, they've never reported abuse, no one in their family has, and yet they come in with a sexually transmitted disease. When these children are questioned by their pediatrician, about 57% fail to disclose. So that's an incredibly high percentage of children at that initial interview. My colleagues and I have surveyed hundreds and hundreds of case files of child sex abuse cases in Los Angeles County. All of these cases have been substantiated or deemed true by social services. When you look at these case files, almost a quarter of the children at some point during the investigation deny abuse that they had previously reported. So false denials do in fact represent a significant problem. Now you might be thinking, why would children do this? Well, there's lots of reasons why. So to give you just a couple of examples, when you begin to look at these reasons, really the common core across all these reasons is fear. Children are afraid for themselves. They're afraid for their own safety. They're afraid of what might happen to their family. They're afraid of what might happen to the perpetrator. And so these fears are real to children. And these fears are something that can lead children to fail to report significant experiences in their lives. So you have this problem of false allegations on the one hand and false denials on the other. So what my colleagues and my students and I at UCI have done for the past 15 years is we've taken a different approach to this. And what we've tried to do is, rather than just document that both of these errors can occur, we've been trying to develop different interview strategies and techniques that concurrently increase truly abused children's willingness to disclose abuse. But we've taken that and we want to balance those interview strategies to make sure that those same strategies don't lead to false allegations among non-abused children. So what I want to do today, because I am a scientist, is I want to kind of unpack this for you and show you how we've gone about trying to test some of these strategies, what seems to work and what doesn't. So one of the strategies that we began with was a strategy that many of you may be very familiar with, and namely that's administering the oath. So if you have a child come in and you say to the child, I'm going to ask you some questions, but I want to start out and I want you to promise to tell me the truth. You can get children as young as 3 or 4 to agree to that promise, and then you can go into your interview. So does the oath work? Well, we've administered this in a variety of different studies, and the good news is that, well, sometimes it does. So sometimes it actually does increase children's disclosures of negative events. But there's 2 problems that we found with the oath. Number 1 is, if children are afraid to tell, having them promise to tell the truth doesn't overcome that fear. And number 2, which is actually a developmental problem, is that if you're going to administer the oath, you're going to ask children to promise to tell the truth, children need to understand the obligatory nature of a promise. And if children don't understand that, they may not understand what you intend, what you'd like them to do. So because of these limitations, we turned to another strategy. And this other strategy is, well, we tried, okay, well, if children are afraid to disclose, what if we make sure that interviewers are highly supportive? And so interviews can behave in a really kind, warm manner throughout an interview. And maybe that will alleviate children's fears and get children to disclose. So again, I'm a scientist. I have to kind of even show you data here in a moment. But let me show you how we do this. So what we do is we'll bring children of various ages into our laboratory. And in one such study, we had them engage in a challenging series of activities with one of our research assistants. And then after a delay, we interview children in either a very warm and supportive manner, the interviewer smiles, maintains eye contact, or we have them interviewed by a cold and intimidating interviewer. And at the risk of offending people, our lab kind of calls these the social work interview versus the police interrogation. So we have children interviewed in one of these two manners. And then what we do is we look at, well, how much did children say and how accurate is the information that they report? Because they were in our lab, we know exactly what happened, so we can verify what they say. So let me just first say that, well, the supportive interviewing, it did not increase how much children said. So when we think about disclosure, we think about getting children to say more, doesn't look like it's that effective. However, supportive interviewing does have some benefits. And one of the benefits is that it actually increased children's accuracy. So it didn't get them to say more, but it did get them to be more accurate when they did report information. So again, here's my data. Scientists like this. They like graphs with bars. So what you can see is you can see our supportive interviewers, children are providing almost twice as many correct responses than when the interviewer is non-supportive. So supportive interviewing, it's not a bad thing. We're not going to recommend to be serious. However, when we step back and we think about this challenge of false denials, it doesn't look like supportive interviewing is the best approach that we can use. So the third strategy that I'm going to tell you about is what we're calling the putative confession. So the way that this putative confession works is when children are interviewed, we begin the interview by saying to the children, you know, the suspect, and you know, we already talked to him, and he already told us everything, and he wants you to tell the truth. We say, so tell us what happened. Now, when you begin a study, you know, when you use this type of strategy, it's really an interesting approach because first of all, because you're telling children that this suspect already told, what you're doing is you're directly addressing children's fears about telling. In addition, the suspect wants children to tell the truth. We didn't ask children to promise to tell the truth, and yet we're giving them this motivation. And third, because we don't tell children explicitly what the suspect said, it's non-leading. And so the meaning of this statement differs depending on what happened to children. So it's a legally permissible, non-leading way of motivating children to disclose. So here it is. So it's overcoming children's fears, it's motivating, and it's non-leading. So how do we go about testing this particular strategy? So again, we bring children into our laboratory and we have them play with a Confederate. Now, for some of the children, while they're playing, this is kind of the beauty of bringing children into your lab, while they're playing, toys break. And this Confederate says to his children, like, ooh, we probably shouldn't have played with those toys, and you know what, can you not tell anybody that this happened? We don't want to get in trouble. So we're inducing children into secrecy. Now, for other children, what happens is they come in and they play with the same Confederate, but none of the toys break. Now, for some of those children, when no toys break, and I'll go back to this in a moment, sometimes we actually have their parents afterward suggest to the children that they know some of the toys broke. Then what we do, we interview all children, and right before the interview, we vary whether we tell the children, you know, that guy you played with, well, he already said what happened, and he wants you to tell the truth, or not. So when you think about our goal of reducing false denials, but also not increasing false allegations, here's what our data show. So this first graph I'll show you is kind of getting at this main issue of reducing false denials. So these are children for whom the toys really broke. What happened when we administered those instructions? I'm thrilled to say they work, they rock. So when you look at this, so the blue bar is your putative confession, and this is the percentage of children who disclosed that the toys broke. And if you look at this, I mean, we doubled the number of children who disclosed this true breakage, so to speak. So in terms of at least our first goal, these type of data really show that yes, this type of putative confession instructions can be a really effective way of increasing disclosures. Okay, but remember, we also have to balance this false report issue. So now what I want to do is I want to show you the percentage of children who falsely reported that the toys broke. And I'm going to show you first before the children who are not given any suggestions. The graph is actually correct because when you don't give children any false suggestions, children don't falsely claim they broke things. Go home, try to convince your children that they broke something. You can ask direct questions, you can even try to mislead them. They do not falsely disclose that they broke something, at least in these types of settings. So, but that's before, these are the children whose parents didn't say anything. What about those children whose parents said to them, kind of before they went into this interview, we know the toys broke, it's okay. Here's the data on the false reports. Now, we did get some, 4% of our sample did falsely report that toys were broken. However, what I want to bring your attention to is that the putative confession, this interview strategy, was no more likely to induce a false report than the control instructions. So when you pitch this strategy and you argue that this strategy works, it really does look like it might be a really effective way of increasing children's disclosures without affecting false reports. So to kind of just summarize these types of strategies and where we've really tried to go is supportive interviewing. I mean, certainly it can be beneficial in terms of reducing children's errors, but not necessarily in terms of increasing children's disclosures. Now, this putative confession is really, what it does appear is that it might be a really promising way of increasing true disclosures without affecting false reports. So people always ask me when I show these types of slides, they say, what, do you want to go, make these types of instructions mandatory at the beginning of all interviews? And absolutely not. These types of instructions may be beneficial for certain children, for whom the suspect is known, the suspect has already been questioned, and for whom reluctance might be a problem. And so what we're now doing in our lab as we expand and continue to test these procedures is we're really trying to determine precisely when a strategy like putative confession might be especially beneficial. And really to kind of step back and to think, more broadly, one of the benefits of this type of work and kind of showing you systematically how we do this is really to show the benefits of science, about how we can take scientific research, take it into a laboratory, and systematically manipulate different types of interview protocols. And if we can do this, what we're hoping we can be able to do is really find the best ways to interview children, to identify those children who have been abused in a way that doesn't lead to false reports. And if we can do this, we really can benefit children, families, and our community. Thank you.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here and have a chance to talk with you about some of the work that I and my collaborators and students have been doing over the last number of decades. And the talk I've been giving lately is called The Memory Factory. So I've been very interested in memories and false memories, how people come to believe and remember that they saw things differently than they really happened, or that they even saw entire events that didn't happen. And over the course of my years of working on these problems, I've developed a few paradigms for studying memory. One of them is now called the misinformation paradigm. And what happens to subjects, and this is our attempt to kind of simulate what goes on in a real crime type situation or accident type situation. We'll show people an event, a simulated crime or accident. We'll expose them to some post-event information, some new information about the event, ostensibly coming from some other individual, and then we'll test our subjects to see what it is they remember. And so in one of the oldest studies that I did, that's still described in a number of introductory psychology textbooks, we showed people a simulated accident, and after the accident, we asked a leading question: how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other? And we found that our subjects estimated the speed of the vehicles as higher than a more neutral question: how fast were the cars going when they hit each other? But that leading smash question did even more, because when you came back to these witnesses a week later and asked them a new question like, did you see any broken glass, those to whom we had asked the smash question were now far more likely to say that they had seen broken glass that didn't exist relative to the more neutral question. In a subsequent experiment, we showed people a simulated accident where a car went through an intersection with a stop sign, and by asking a single leading question that suggested it was a yield sign, we convinced lots and lots of our subject witnesses that they'd seen a yield sign at the intersection, not a stop sign. And in a study that we published just last year, we used a very unusual group of subjects, soldiers who are learning what it's going to be like for them if they are ever captured as prisoners of war. They're undergoing a survival school experience, and during this experience, they are interrogated in an aggressive, hostile, physically abusive way for a half hour, and later on they have to identify the person who conducted that interrogation. And we found that with a little misinformation, we could get lots and lots of people to misidentify the perpetrator, often identifying somebody who didn't even remotely resemble him. And so now I've given you a little primer on something called the misinformation effect. If you expose people to misinformation about a crime, about an accident, about an everyday ordinary event that they might have experienced, it has the potential to contaminate, transform, or distort their memory. And out there in the real world, misinformation is everywhere. We pick up misinformation when we talk to other witnesses who might have been present at the scene of a crime or accident, when we're interrogated in suggestive or leading ways, when we turn on the television or read a newspaper article about some event, maybe a high publicity event that we might have witnessed. All of these provide the opportunity for new information to become available and to potentially contaminate somebody's memory. In the 1990s, I began to notice an even more extreme form of memory problem. Some people were going into therapy with one kind of problem. They had an eating disorder. Maybe they were depressed. Maybe they were just less interested in life. And they were coming out of therapy with a different problem: horrific memories of abuse, sometimes claiming they were raped for a decade, sometimes claiming they were raped in satanic rituals, forced into animal sacrifice, baby breeding, baby sacrifice, the works. And one of the things, that it was natural to ask is, where are these bizarre memories coming from? And one of the things that we began to notice is that many of these individuals had been in a certain kind of psychotherapy. And so we asked, were some of the things going on in this psychotherapy leading these individuals to have these bizarre memories, like guided imagination or dream interpretation or hypnosis or exposure to false memories? And so we began to try to figure out how could we design some studies that could explore the potential for these processes or these manipulations even inadvertent manipulations, to lead people to false memories. That's when we developed a new paradigm. And we now call this the rich false memory paradigm. In this scientific work, there's no event to begin with, but we ply people with suggestions about their past, and then we come back to them later and we ask them questions about the past, about their childhood or about their more recent past. So the first study that we did on this, using this rich false memory paradigm, trying to think of something that we could plant in the minds of people that would have been at least mildly traumatic if it had happened, but wouldn't be so traumatic it would have upset our experimental subjects. We suggested to subjects that when they were a kid, 5 or 6 years old, they were lost in a shopping mall. They were frightened, crying, and ultimately they were rescued by an elderly person, reunited with the family. And by the time we were done with 3 suggestive interviews, we'd convinced a quarter of our sample of ordinary adults that they'd had this experience that we'd made up. Critics came back, they said, you know, getting lost is so common. If you're going to talk about this on the same page, in the same paragraph, as you're talking about memories for satanic ritual abuse, at least show us you can plant a false memory for something that would be a little more upsetting or bizarre or unusual. And other investigators and we ourselves did these studies, planting a rich false memory that when you were a kid, you nearly drowned and had to be rescued by a lifeguard. This was a study done at the University of Tennessee. They succeeded with about 1/3 of their adults. And in a study done in Canada, they planted a false memory that something as awful as being attacked by a vicious animal happened to you when you were a child, succeeding with about half of their subjects. And in a study done in Italy, planted a false memory that you witnessed a person being demonically possessed. So these rich false memories could be planted in the minds of ordinary people. When I came to UCI and continued this research, I got very interested in the consequences of a false memory. So if I plant a false memory in you, does it have repercussions? Does it affect your later thoughts, your later intentions, your later behaviors? And with my graduate students and postdoc, we planted false memories that you got sick eating particular foods, dill pickles, strawberry ice cream, and we found that we could affect not only your thoughts about the particular food, but what you actually ate when we put food in front of you. Now, these false memories aren't necessarily bad. We also found that we could plant a false memory, a warm, fuzzy memory of a healthy food. We did this with asparagus, and you want to eat more asparagus. And just last year, we planted false memories. We published a study where we succeeded in planting false memories that you got sick on vodka as a teenager, and people don't want vodka as much. I find this manipulation doesn't work on me, but it does work on our experimental subjects. So, along with this ability to plant false memories and to control people's behavior comes a number of ethical dilemmas for our society, such as when should we use this mind technology and should we ever ban its use? Well, I've been working on problems of memory and memory distortion for many decades now, and I do have to say that the one take-home lesson that I've learned is this. Just because somebody tells you something with confidence, just because they describe it in a lot of detail, just because they express it with a lot of emotion, it doesn't mean that it really happened. You need independent corroboration to know whether a memory is authentic or whether it's a product of some other process. And such a discovery might have helped to save the hundreds and hundreds of innocent people who have been convicted of crimes that they did not do. And we now know that faulty human memory is the major cause of those convictions. So I'll leave you with one last message. If I've learned anything, memory, like liberty, is a fragile thing. Thank you.
you for having me. Well, I don't always think about morality, but when I do, I think Dick Cheney. Now, I don't mean this in a partisan way at all. In fact, the reason I bring him up is because his moral system is really so universal in some ways. It reveals these universal truths. So on almost every issue you can imagine, Dick Cheney defines the right end of the continuum. So he's a military hawk, he's pro-enhanced interrogation, he's pro-life, pro-big oil corporations, pro-guns. But there's one issue on which he is on the other side. Does anybody know what that is? Same-sex marriage. He's in favor of same-sex marriage. Well, why is that? He's got a daughter who he loves very much, I assume, and who, again, has married with a couple of children. And there's something that's so sort of important about that, I think, that if you think about, do you think he arose, developed this set of moral beliefs because of some principled system? He's got a bunch of principles that somehow can explain why he's on the right end of the continuum on all these issues, and then gay marriage has this pro-gay marriage attitude. That's probably not what happens. What we think it is his emotions, that somehow his emotions are organizing his moral beliefs and leading him to have this interesting sort of confluence of beliefs. And so what I want to talk about a little bit is about what that is, what kind of moral system that is, and what implications it has for politics and the law. So I want to begin with this idea, this sort of new view of morality that's developed in the last decade that we've called moral intuitionism. It really begins a long time ago with David Hume, the famous philosopher who was a big fan of the passions, who thought that passion was the smarter system than reason in many ways, and talked about morality depending on our sentiments. When any action or quality of the mind pleases us, we say it is virtuous. So it's really this new view of morality rejects an older view that was, we call a rationalist view, that really viewed children as little moral philosophers. They were developing these sets of principles that got ever more sophisticated over time. And again, that's how they use these principles then to decide what's right and what's wrong. But what later research has shown, I think, very compellingly, is that right and wrong are things that we feel more than things that we think, that we have a sense that things are right or wrong, they're just or unjust. And then when we, it's not that we use a principle to develop those, but rather we decide that they're just, and then we develop the principles backward to explain those in this sort of post hoc fashion. So we don't really reason very much about our moral beliefs, except for in response to some social demand, some request to explain them or defend them or to persuade other people. Again, morality is more this emotional affair than a cognitive affair, and so, but we have to think more broadly about what sort of the emotional infrastructure that underlies it. And what I've been working on for the last 6 or 7 years is, in collaboration with John Haidt now at NYU, is what's called moral foundation theory, that tries to explain what these basic sets of intuitions are that underlie our intuitive morality. And again, the idea is that across cultures, the moral systems are built on 5 basic intuitions or foundations. They're kind of like moral taste buds. That's an analogy that we use a lot. They're these sensitivities that we have to certain kinds of events that lead us to have these moral reactions. And the 5 that we talk about are harm and care, the idea that it's right to take care of people, even vulnerable people, and it's wrong to harm others. An innate sense of justice or fairness based on sort of equality, that resources should be allocated equitably across people. In-group loyalty, the idea that we should be loyal to certain groups, and that one of the sort of worst things you can do morally is to betray a group that you're a part of. Authority and respect, the idea that there are certain authorities that you should, again, accord respect to, and authoritative institutions that you should respect and honor, and the idea of purity and sanctity, that every moral system, every religion in particular has a view of a state that's close to God, a state that's pure, that's uncontaminated, and that there's ways to sort of contaminate yourself by engaging in certain acts, sexual acts, drug abuse, that sort of thing, that your body, not treating your body as a temple, but rather as a plaything. And each of these moral intuitions has a basis in primate evolution. The whole idea is that it's an emotional system that's designed to suppress selfishness and promote group cooperation. And what's interesting to us now is that each of these sensitivities is present in all people, we think, but they're dialed up and down, and people can become more sensitive or less sensitive to some of them, based on a complicated set of biological and personal experience factors and cultural factors. And so what we've been interested in is to use this theory to try to understand this crazy political environment that we're in now, this hyper-partisan culture war that we're part of, and we've used it to try to explain what it is that the differences in the nature of liberal and conservative morality. One of the things that's the sort of tangible product of this collaboration has been a website that we developed called yourmorals.org, which we use to collect data. And so people can get onto this website, register. There's a whole series of surveys, questionnaires, experiments on that survey. If you fill these out, you get feedback that tells you what the study was about, what the questionnaire measured, where you rank relative to other people. And today we've have a data set that has about 400,000 participants in it, so it's a huge data set. And one of the major things that we look at is this moral foundation questionnaire, which measures these 5 different moral foundations. And so let me tell you a little bit about the data here. Again, this is a big data set, so in this particular graph has 194,000 people and change, and it's very stable numbers. On the left, we simply, the judgment here is how relevant each of these things are to your moral beliefs, from extremely relevant to not very relevant. And on the bottom is just a simple sort of typical 7-point scale from very liberal to very conservative politically that people respond to. So again, and each of these have a little sample item on the bottom. So this is, again, a multi-item scale, but one sample item, whether or not someone cared for someone who is weak or vulnerable, that's harm, and whether or not someone some people were treated differently from others. Again, how relevant are these to your moral system? And what you see in these first 2 intuitions or foundations show a similar pattern. Almost everyone believes they're very relevant to their moral system, and they differ very little across the political spectrum. There's slight difference where liberals tend to endorse these more than extreme conservatives, but basically high and consistent across them all. The other 3 show a different pattern. So in group, whether or not someone showed a lack of loyalty, authority, whether or not someone conformed to the traditions of society, and purity, whether or not someone did something that was disgusting. Again, those show a different pattern where liberals tend not to see these as very relevant to their moral systems, but extreme conservatives see them as much more relevant. And so this is the way, if you look across these, what you get an image of is of the different moral systems of liberals and conservatives. So liberals essentially have a 2-factor morality, where if it doesn't harm anybody or it isn't unfair, it's not wrong. These other sorts of things, doing something disgusting or not being loyal to your group, really aren't seen as deep moral values, that just sort of less extreme offenses. So again, it's all about harm and fairness for a liberal. For conservatives, however, they have a 5-factor morality, such that they basically care about all 5 of these things about the same. So in-group authority and purity concerns are things that are important to their moral systems. And this is a very consistent pattern over time, it is over time as well, but it's also across samples. So let me just give you a little bit of a sample. These are just respondents who come from different parts of the world, and you can see that the same basic pattern shows up everywhere. So here's the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, South Asia, East Asia, and Southeast Asia, right? So the same essential pattern here. So it's very consistent. Again, these data aren't quite as compelling as you might want. These aren't the most native individuals there. They speak English. They got onto a website where they could complete these scales. But again, it shows that this is not, this is a pattern. It's very consistent, and we have a good grip on that liberals and conservatives, no matter what country, tend to show this sort of pattern. Now, what's interesting is if you could apply this to, again, let's go back to this issue of gay marriage, where it makes sense to what the different political teams believe about these and how they feel about gay marriage. So from a liberal's perspective, gay marriage and gay marriage laws, something that whether we want to instantiate that in law, is a great moral cause. There's nothing wrong with it. It doesn't hurt anybody. In fact, it hurts people if they don't have it, and it's only fair that same-sex people can get married. Again, this idea of marriage equality. What's interesting is that a conservative might very well share those kinds of intuitions at some level. The same ideas about harm and fairness, but they also feel that, gee, I wish they'd just be better group members. You hear, very often you will hear people say, well, gee, if gay people would just act more like other people, then it would just be fine, right? And so there's this in-group sense of it. It's traditional marriage. So it offends the sort of authority, the sense of traditional institutions, and a lot of people have this sense it's just something that just doesn't seem pure about it. It seems kind of, and I don't want to throw around technical terms, but icky, right? And that's the sense that people have this sense. And so from a liberal's perspective, it's a very clear moral question. From a conservative's perspective, even if they're not particularly homophobic, they're morally conflicted about it. There's more going on there. There's certain things that bother them a little bit about it, so that they're less likely to sort of pursue endorsing that, to put it into law. Now, you can also see the change occurring. This has been one of the most sort of radical social changes we've seen, in recent history. The change in opinions about gay marriage. You can see that some of that is because some of this, as people get to know more gay people, as they become more part of the American culture, that the senses of ickiness go away, the sense of groupiness start to drift away, and we see, again, a much more positive view of gay marriage emerging. Now, there's another part. So you can use this moral foundations theory to try to understand political attitudes and how people feel about laws, these laws in the big sense. And there's another very insidious effect, however, that they have. And it's captured in part here. This is something you hear a lot these days if you listen to politics. This quote that's usually attributed to Daniel Patrick Moynihan, that you're entitled to your own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts. Well, the interesting part is that very often people do have their own facts, and this is in part how it emerges, we believe. So again, most of you, if you think about what your political and moral beliefs are, you view them as sort of bottom-up construction. So you have certain principles, you combine those with facts, and use a little bit of logic, and you come up with, that's how I decided I'm a liberal or I'm a conservative. Now, what a lot of research suggests, however, is that the process goes the other way around as well, that these political and moral beliefs shape the way and organize the way that we think of principles, facts, and the way we use logic. So that they can change the way that what we believe about all these things in order to support these intuitions and ground them in principle and fact and logic. And we've done research, my lab has done research on all of these different factors and how they're shaped by political beliefs. Let me give you one example of an experiment that was designed to test this kind of idea. So it was a fairly simple study where we had took 128 UCI students, and we had them record their beliefs about the morality of a whole bunch of issues, But the one that we're interested in here is the death penalty. So they record their beliefs about the morality and the benefits and costs of the death penalty. By benefits, things like whether the death penalty deters crime, and the costs are things like whether, if you have the death penalty, do you have some, what's the likelihood you're going to have wrongful executions. So they record their beliefs. Then they read essays that were designed to try to change their beliefs about the morality of the death penalty. There was no facts really involved in this. It was just the idea that the death penalty is wrong. It's morally wrong to take a life, or it's morally acceptable to take a life. In fact, it's mandatory. If somebody takes somebody else's life, society really has a moral obligation to take that life back, in a sense. So we were trying to persuade them just about the morality. We never mentioned anything about deterring crime. We didn't mention anything about wrongful executions. These are all just moral arguments. And then we had them at the end re-record their beliefs about morality and costs and benefits. And so let me show you what happens here. So we were able, so just taking one at a time, we were able to, again, move, this is change from pre to post in their beliefs. So we were able to make them believe more in the morality of capital punishment. So they thought it was this group that received the capital punishment essay, the pro-capital punishment essay, believed more in capital punishment afterwards. They also, however, believed much more strongly in whether it deterred crime, and they thought it was less likely to produce wrongful executions, even though we hadn't mentioned those things at all. But just believing that it was more moral made those facts sort of become, have them believe those facts more. The opposite happens when we were much more successful at getting them to believe that capital punishment was wrong, and then when you do that, they believe less in the deterrent efficacy of the death penalty, and they believe more in the cost. They estimate the probability of it producing wrongful executions as being higher. And again, these things weren't as important as they weren't mentioned. All we had is give them the feeling that the death penalty was more wrong or more morally right, and the facts sort of followed along. And so if you think about what the implications of this sort of phenomena are, again, it's a good explanation. If you look at the culture war today, it's less a war of morality than it is a war about facts. So that we have liberals having their own set of facts, conservatives having their set of facts, and again, they're all organized by these moral intuitions, or at least part of the process is that if you look at the sorts of beliefs, and I don't mean you to read these in particular, but the idea is that in each case, what's really happening is that people are believing that whatever is moral is effective. So the things that they think are morally right are the things that are practically effective, and that helps to explain what the sort of information gap, belief gap is in modern politics. So just to sort of sum up, the way I would sort of place myself in this group is this idea that this clash between intuitive morality and the law, which I find so interesting, that in a sense you can think of the law as an attempt to codify our moral intuitions. We want laws that reward the good things we do, punish the bad things that we do. But those things often clash, right? That sometimes there are laws that don't seem to us very moral. And people, for example, when there's a lot of evidence that people are much more likely to obey a law if they intuitively feel that it's moral. When they don't, you get these problems, this sort of clash that I find so interesting. So you see that in these politically controversial issues where two sides simply don't. They will fight for one side will fight for the law because they believe it to be morally correct. The other side will fight against. You see at a smaller level, again, you see these sorts of this clash, like in inadmissible evidence. When you see some evidence that suggests that this person is guilty, but you just can't use it. You know they're guilty, but you know you're not supposed to use it. That captures that same sort of thing. Another sort of phenomena that we've been interested in my lab is moral culpability, and when people perceive somebody as morally responsible for their behavior. And you get these this is a really new area that's going to be very interesting when we get neuroscientific evidence of some sort of brain dysfunction that an individual has, and whether you can, people tend to find that as very plausible explanation that removes moral culpability. But they don't perceive abuse from a child in childhood or some of these other things necessarily as exculpatory. And so there's a lot of intuition about what counts as somebody having the moral responsibility for their actions and what doesn't. All these things, of course, are compounded and by the fact that these moral intuitions shape facts. And particularly at the political level, the idea that if you think it's hard to agree on anything, if you don't agree on, if you have a difference of moral opinion, it's very different if you have a disagreement about what the basic facts are, and that makes lawmaking very challenging. So I guess it's our hope that understanding intuitive morality can lead to better law, and ultimately, if we understand the way each other think, it'll lead to more civil politics as well. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me here to talk. I'm the only non-psychologist. I'm probably also the only non-American. But I am working on law, and I'm very inspired by psychology. And today I would like to take you to my journey. How did I get towards being interested in psychology? And also to tell you a little bit about what we are going to do with psychology. So I study a big problem, as all of us today are studying big problems. Mine is a problem of how do you build a rule of law? How do you, in a situation where 30 years ago there were hardly any legal institutions, the Ministry of Justice was closed, most lawyers were purged, there were no courts, they were done away with in a Cultural Revolution, there were hardly any laws. How do you go from that in 30 years to a system where rules have been developed, but also to make that one where they actually do something, where they're complied with? So why do Chinese obey the law? This is, of course, not a question that's just relevant for China. It's a question that's relevant for many legal systems. Why do people obey the law? How can we find ways through which we can get people in a more, I would say, efficient way or a more morally sound way to comply with rules? How can we design rules that do that in a better way? So that's what my talk today is about. So let me show you some pictures of China's compliance challenge. I think by now most people know about China's air pollution. Did you also know that China has major water pollution issues? About 200 million Chinese, that's 1 in 6, are severely ill because of drinking polluted water. Soil pollution, other kinds of solid waste pollution, it's a major challenge. About 750,000 people die prematurely in China because of air pollution. If I have to find any way to say that what I'm doing in my research, which has centered for about 14 years on environment, is important, it's just those numbers. And of course, it's not just a Chinese problem. Chinese pollution, according to the US EPA, also blows into California. And that is even a problem. And of course, in the region, it's very much a problem. Another issue that I think even influences more Chinese is land. Chinese people have lost their land without due compensation. 1 in 5 farmers, China's 750 million farmers, have lost their land without due compensation. Food safety. What you see here is not only nice food, I like eating this kind of food, street food, but also they happen to be using gutter oil. Gutter oil is oil that is not used in cooking process, but actually used from other process, mechanical process, and used in cooking. It's one of the many issues that can explain to you why so many Chinese are worried about food safety, and also why, if I was one of the 7 people governing China, I would worry about the environment. But probably losing power, it's going to be food. I mean, people and food is a very strong relationship. Also, Chinese people have been very angry when they found out that their top leadership had their own food shipped to them from special organic farms. So if as a modern government where you're developing and you're giving economic growth, you cannot sustain basic food safety, it's a big issue. Of course, environment is as well. Labor. We all have nice laptops from China. I have. Probably the least worst labor problems in China are the ones we know about. Okay, so we all worry about our little apples and the labor conditions there. Has any of you ever visited a Chinese mine? You don't want to know what the labor conditions are there. In Chinese mines, they still have the highest incidence of death related to unsafety. I work a lot in chemical fertilizer factories, other factories in the country. That's where you get really bad labor conditions. But again, China has unsafe labor. Second problem with labor is people aren't getting paid. It's a lot of unpaid wages. Third is long hours and other kinds of things you can imagine. Finally, or second, finally, we can also think about IP. It's one of the biggest worries for US companies, also other companies. If they go and invest in China, they're going to lose their technology. Also, their products get stolen in the Chinese market. I'm not saying China is unique in that. This happens in many countries. We only have to think about downloading and what teenagers are doing with downloading software. But still, it's a major challenge. Finally, there's corruption. Even though China doesn't score that high, in my eyes, on the corruption perception index, it's about 60th in the world. So if one is the best, which is Finland sometimes, and it kind of alterates, and the lowest is Nigeria or Indonesia or Bangladesh. China is somewhere in the middle. But if you talk with Chinese, their major concern is corruption. They talk about it all the time. For all of these things, we can say, look, China has made laws. It has. Whereas in the 80s, early 80s or 78, when it started to rebuild its legal system, it just didn't have any rules. I mean, formal legal rules. It had a lot of rules within the Communist Party. Now it has very complex legal rules. If you go to the Long Institute, I have my Chinese language library in the Long Institute building. Just current environmental law is this much. And this is central level, excluding standards. If I would include standards, I would have to walk there. So there's plenty of rules. A couple of years ago, Wu Bangguo, the head of the National People's Congress, China's main legislator, he said, look, we have basically made our legal system. We have the rules. The challenge is implementation. And that is a core challenge. How do you get to make these rules work in practice? I always, when I teach, I bring a legal text. Assume I'm holding the law here. I always ask my students, what am I holding? So they'll say, well, the law, or they'll say, what law? No, look better. What am I holding? At some point, somebody says paper. It's paper. How does paper do anything? That's what my research is about. I want to understand, how does paper, how does this? I mean, I started out as a lawyer really believing that, oh, if I write it down this way and I do it this way, then it will change this and that in reality. I've traveled a lot. So what I did is I started with the paper. I started in the capital in Beijing, where it's made, talked with the people how they made it, what they thought it would make. And then I went all the way down to the countryside. Why did I end up in the countryside? Well, I first interviewed law enforcement officials. I wasn't sure whether I could believe what they said, so I went to factories. It's all about environmental law. And wasn't sure whether the factories were telling the truth, so I went to villages living next to factories. So I ended up really with my feet in the dirt, looking back at Beijing at the law. Then, for instance, I found out that not only environmental law, but I was also studying land rights, that the rules that were made in Beijing, they trickled down, only a little bit came down to the ground. People who didn't even have access to the full law, and they wouldn't read the full thing. So what was happening? So my key question has been, how can we get, if the situation is that most people break rules, how can we break out of this vicious circle of weak enforcement and limited compliance? If most people break the rules, enforcement will be weak. The most important effect of enforcement isn't punishment. All the literature on deterrence shows. It's the certainty of getting punished. It's the certainty of getting caught. So if there's many people breaking rules, this certainty will go down automatically. So that's a very big problem. And then China has the extra problem where all of this happens in what I call a capture-prone governance context. That's a long sentence. What I mean by that is three things. First of all, in China, there's very close state-market ties. You cannot often distinguish the government from companies. So if the government is the one, for instance, that is supposed to enforce environmental rules, it's doing it sort of on its own entities. That's the first problem. Much more difficult, I think, than in the US. Second problem is you have formal and informal rules. So there's the law, and underneath that there's all these kinds of informal rules, informal connections and guanxi between different people, and also party-type rules. Finally, China is an authoritarian state, and it has very limited civil society. And because of that, there's very limited checks and balances outside of the formal system. All of that makes things more difficult. So how do you break out of this? This is the core research question that all my research is about. I'm going to talk about three different things that we've done. The first thing that we've done is, over the last years, we've tried to look at cases where something major was tried in China. First, I looked at enforcement campaigns. These are major national level political organized enforcement drives, like the war on drugs in the US or zero tolerance on crime, or things like that. So we looked at their effects. And in the several campaigns that I've studied, both anti-corruption campaigns, food safety campaigns, environment, the conclusion was there's a short-term effect. You see that for short term there's more compliance, but it's very difficult to sustain it because in the longer run there simply isn't enough sustained pressure through these campaigns. It's very difficult for the political center to influence local level enforcement agents for a longer period of time. They simply don't have the resources. Second, people learn from these campaigns that, okay, it's off and on. A very good example is intellectual property rights. How do you know when a campaign is ongoing in China? They are ongoing nearly every day, somewhere. If you know what to look for, you'll see them. If you want to buy your little illegal DVDs, I should say different. If you want to buy legal DVDs, because there's no shop where you can buy illegal ones, and it's very difficult to actually distinguish legal and illegal DVDs in most shops, you'll find that if you go out to your favorite shop, it's closed. Why is it closed? So one of the shops that I would go to sometimes, not that I ever bought any DVDs, I was just researching. It was located right next to the police station that was going to enforce a particular campaign. And when I went there, they were closed. I went to several others, they were all closed. I went to the shop owner and I said, what's going on? What is happening today? Nothing. I said, are you sure? And I found out later there was a campaign. They all closed for a day. So the police officials who were located right next to this actual bureau, they would look around and they would say, okay, we're doing a campaign, let's check this. Do we see any violation? No, we don't, because they're closed. The next day they open again. So it's short-term effects, it's very ad hoc. We also looked at recentralization, also found limited effect. A recent project, I've looked at multiple regulators. So what happens if we involve citizens in law enforcement? We found that that only works if you increase freedoms of citizens. And of course, that's a very difficult thing to do in China, especially freedom of association, which is a core thing if you want citizens to actually be empowered enough to take a stance. So the second thing I've started to do is to switch things around. I wish I had the kind of PowerPoint techniques of Pete that I could just switch things around. So we try to look at it not from the perspective of the law or the perspective of law enforcement officials, but look at it from the perspective of companies. So if you are a Chinese company or a Chinese citizen, why do you obey rules? Why do you break them? Especially the first question is interesting. Look, in a situation where it seems to be very logical, based on all these variables, to break the law, why would you ever be crazy enough to comply with it? So we selected case studies where we looked at people obeying rules. I'll very briefly explain one to you. Lawyers paying taxes in China. It's not very, it doesn't make sense for a Chinese lawyer to pay taxes. So taxes cost more than they benefit directly, if you make a very direct analysis, especially in China. People have limited support for taxes. When I interviewed lawyers about taxes, they said, look, the government just doesn't like lawyers. They're asking us to pay much more taxes, so they're stealing from us. And they also thought most other people weren't paying taxes. So what we saw is actually that most lawyers that did pay taxes, they saw it as a very high risk. And here's a puzzle. There was no law enforcement. There is virtually no law enforcement on lawyers cheating on taxes. So why do they see a high risk? We found that this comes largely because of the clients and the law firm, but also because they generally are afraid of the government, being lawyers, in China, and you're much more pressured by the government. So I can give many more examples of the current studies that we're doing. We're looking at food safety in restaurants. We're actually working in restaurants. One of my students is doing anthropological observations, looking at the processes of compliance. How does the paper enter the workplace? Looking at training of people, looking at how it shapes, for instance, compliance with washing of hands rules. China, there's 13 situations under which you should wash your hands in a restaurant if you work there. We're also looking at worker safety in construction industry in China. These huge construction sites where one of my other students is working now. And we just finished a large study of pesticide compliance by Chinese farmers. This brings me to the present. I only have 1 more minute left, so I have to be short. I found that with all my prior research, which I will continue because it's important, our end conclusions were often, it's more complex than we thought, which I'm very happy with as a scholar. It's normal, but increasingly frustrated with as a human being. I want to look at these problems and try and solve them. So we're trying increasingly to see, are there ways in which, or new ways outside of these large institutional frameworks, outside these things that are very difficult to change, are there other thoughts? And I found psychology offers a lot of ideas and also methods, especially the experimental method, where one can try and see whether there's ways in which to improve compliance with the law. I'll give you one very simple example. There's a scholar called Dan Ariely. He and his group study cheating and lying, and they've mainly studied people in the US. And they had one idea where, okay, if we get people to sign a pledge to promise that they won't lie, how long will that reduce lying amongst people? And they found, well, it works for a while. It doesn't work for a long run. Okay, that's interesting, but not so much for my research. Then they did a follow-up study, and they looked at insurance fraud. And they said, okay, based on this idea, if we find that insurance forms are wrong, if we get people to sign at the top to promise that they will not lie on the form, instead of at the bottom when they've already filled it out, maybe we can decrease insurance fraud. And they found they could decrease it. This, for me, is one example of a particular form of compliance where we can find a different way of working on it. So we're now working with Pete and with Beth and with Tran Sheng, who's also on the faculty here, and with Nick Scourge, to find ways in which to carry out experiments. On the one hand, to find better solutions. The other hand is, what are the cultural differences? Are Chinese different in how they respond to sanctions than Americans? What does that mean then for laws in the US and in China? What does it mean for businesses that have to manage compliance when they're working in the US and in China? I want to leave it at that, and thank you very much.
I was asked to offer concluding remarks. I think I should just say thank you for coming, and there's refreshments outside. Let me offer a few thoughts. Now, I have to apologize. I don't have a PowerPoint. I'd like to say I don't have a PowerPoint because I just got to listen to this and decide while I was sitting here what I was going to say, but I don't know how to use PowerPoint anyway. I've never done a PowerPoint in my whole life. And I guess, like Benjamin, I have to say I'm a lawyer and not a psychologist. And so that's the perspective that I want to speak from for a few minutes. What these presentations tell us about the law and the legal system, and especially some of the really most important underlying problems with regard to the law and the legal system. And I think what I can do is take the presentations, I'm going to speak with them out of order, and say that you can really look at a continuum of what goes on in law and the legal system from what's said. You can talk about, well, what are the problems in terms of what's the appropriate focus, especially of the criminal law? And think about, well, once we have a criminal law, what are the problems with regard to investigations, especially investigations with regard to crimes against children? And once there's investigation completed and there's trial, I think some of the presentations heard are, what are the problems with regard to trials in the legal system? And then you can talk about, well, once we're done with that phase of the criminal justice system, what are the problems that we face in terms of how to punish people within the legal system, especially how we punish children? And then finally, you get the underlying question of, well, how do you enforce things within the legal system? What I want to suggest is some interrelationships among the presentations. If you look at these 5 questions, and you look at them as really a continuum from the beginning to the end, or what's more likely, a process that is cyclical and circular. Let me just say a few words about each and what the presentations raise for us to think about in terms of these underlying problems in the legal system. I said, one thing that they raise is the problem of, well, what's the appropriate focus of the law, and especially of the criminal law? And here I go to Professor Ditto's presentation in terms of what's the relationship between our moral judgments and what's appropriate for the criminal law to punish. And here I want to focus on a Supreme Court case from a little over a decade ago when you might be familiar with a case called Lawrence versus Texas. Texas had a statute that prohibited private, consensual, adult homosexual activity. The statute called this a crime against nature. And the question was, did it violate the Constitution for the state to punish such private, consensual, adult homosexual activity? Texas's argument to the United States Supreme Court was that the state could make a moral judgment that homosexual behavior is wrong and thus criminally punish this conduct. And the issue before the Supreme Court was, is this a sufficient justification to make such laws constitutional? And the Supreme Court, 6-3, declared the Texas law unconstitutional, rejecting the moral justification as being inadequate as a basis for the law. But then the question is, if this moral justification is insufficient for the law, what about other laws that rest on a moral justification? Think of laws against prostitution. Maybe we could make a public health argument against them, but isn't it really that they're based on a moral judgment that it's wrong to sell sex for money? Or what about laws that prohibit gambling? Aren't they really based on a moral justification? Or what about laws that make consumption of drugs with a person just hurting himself or herself a crime? Well, isn't that based on a moral justification? How much of the prison population today is for people for these crimes, especially drug crimes? And so don't we really, if we're going to think about morals in the law, need to focus on when is a moral justification for a law sufficient as a basis for it, and when should we say the moral justification isn't sufficient for it? It certainly can't be that we're going to let the Supreme Court decide which moral judgments they like and which they don't like. There's got to be some principle here, and that's why I think your research about morality in the law is so important. Well, assume that we've made the decision that there's going to be a criminal law. Then there's going to have to be investigation about the criminal law. And if you think of that as sort of a second step in this continuum we've been talking about today, and especially here's what Professor Klaus was talking about in terms of investigations concerning children. And it was fascinating to hear her talk about that there's not only a problem of false accusations by children, but also false denials by children. Now, traditionally, the legal system has been much more concerned with false allegations than with false denials. That's because we have a legal system that's always believed it's much better to let 100 guilty people go free than to convict one innocent person. And a false allegation could lead to somebody being wrongly incarcerated. Yet there are also costs to false denials in that guilty people won't be punished. They then remain free to continue to commit the crime. And the less we're punishing the guilty, the more we're going to undermine effective enforcement, going to Professor Van Roy's comments at the very end. As I was listening to Professor Klaus, I was fascinated to think about, is it really possible to decrease false denials without increasing false accusations? That if we decrease false denials, isn't there really a danger that we're going to be giving more weight to those who are making false allegations? And then the question is, can we design a system that will simultaneously decrease false allegations and also false denials? And how does our current system create biases in this regard? I worry, for example, that investigators of child abuse inherently have a bias towards finding abuse rather than a bias against finding abuse, because that's where they come from. You had up on the screen the People magazine cover McMartin Preschool. The investigators began with the assumption that there was abuse, and then they were able to get testimony about that. And can we create a system that will effectively separate the false from the true allegation? Well, especially when you're dealing with children, can we adequately cross-examine children to get at the truth, or is the allegation often sufficient as a basis for the crime? And so the investigation phase becomes very important, and it immediately, to me, goes to the third phase, which is what Professor Loftus was talking about. From my perspective, it's, well, what about the problems at trial? Now, you could certainly take what Professor Klaus was talking about in terms of children and their testimony at trial, but I think also in terms of what Professor Loftus said about, there's the much more general problem of when witnesses testify at trial about what they've seen or heard or remember, they have tremendous weight with juries. Now, perhaps children less so, but I don't think that's necessarily so. Definitely when you're dealing with adults, when the witness is on the stand and says, that person who's the defendant is the one who did the crime, That's tremendously powerful in leading to convictions. As Beth said towards the end, we know of hundreds and hundreds of innocent people who are convicted on the basis of faulty testimony. Then I think the problem for the legal system is, how can we better identify when somebody is testifying truthfully or falsely? The usual ways of dealing with this, trying to shake the memory of the person, don't work for exactly the reasons that Professor Loftus says. The person has come to truly believe that his or her memory is accurate, even if it's a false memory. So the usual way in which we try to impeach a witness isn't going to be successful in this regard. Now, I think this is a place where the Supreme Court really has failed. The Supreme Court went decades without dealing with a case that concerned eyewitness testimony and identifications. The Supreme Court had a case just a couple of years ago about this, Perry versus New Hampshire. This involved a woman looking out of a room and seeing a suspect in the parking lot, and then later testifying at trial that the person she'd seen in the parking lot was the defendant. Well, it was obviously very suggestive. There was only one person in the parking lot. It was who she remembered. It wasn't as if even it was a lineup where she was choosing someone from the lineup. And should we really give such weight to recollection that was an observation from a distance and an observation in a dark evening? And the Supreme Court in an 8-1 decision said, no problem. Since the police didn't do anything to create the suggestiveness, it doesn't violate the Constitution. Only if the police themselves create the suggestiveness is it reason to be concerned. And yet doesn't Professor Loftus's research tell us we have to be very concerned about eyewitness identification and memories based on it, even if it's not the police creating the suggestiveness? Justice Sotomayor wrote a terrific dissent in which she relied on research from Professor Loftus and others to say, we now know of so many innocent people being convicted on the basis of false eyewitness identifications. Don't we have to do something with that problem? And yet the Supreme Court here didn't do anything about it. So if you continue along the continuum from what's going to be a crime to investigation to trial, you then get to, well, what about punishment? What kind of punishment is appropriate? There are so many studies that show that over-incarceration in the United States means that we incarcerate more people than any other Western or developed nation, and by an enormous margin. The first case I ever got to argue in the United States Supreme Court was on behalf of a man by the name of Leandro Andrade, who was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 50 years for stealing $153 worth of videotapes from Kmart stores in San Bernardino, California. He received this sentence under California's Three Strikes Law, even though he had never committed a violent crime. Prior to California's Three Strikes Law, no one in the history of the United States had ever received a life sentence for shoplifting. And so when I think what Professor Kaufman talks about with regard to children, to me it's a part of a larger problem of over-incarceration in the United States. And it's important to think about how we've gotten to this point, why politicians are always willing to vote for longer sentences and harsher punishments, because they don't want to give the soundbite to their opponent at the next election saying this person's soft on crime. This is an area where the Supreme Court has begun to address some of what Professor Kaufman talks about, unlike the other places we've talked about where I don't think the court has. For example, the Supreme Court in 2005, in a case called Roper versus Simmons, says it's cruel and unusual punishment to impose the death penalty for a crime committed by a juvenile. In 2010, in a case called Graham versus Florida, the Supreme Court said it's cruel and unusual punishment to impose a sentence of life without parole for a non-homicide crime committed by a juvenile. And then just a couple of years ago in Miller versus Alabama, the Supreme Court said that generally it's cruel and unusual punishment to impose life without parole, even for a homicide committed by a juvenile. At least there cannot be a mandatory sentence of life without parole for a crime committed by a juvenile. So I think this is the recognition of what Professor Kaufman is talking about. In fact, in all three of these cases, the majority opinions for the Supreme Court, and the first two are by Justice Kennedy and the last by Justice Kagan, rely very much on the difference between the adult brain and the juvenile brain, and especially with regard to things like the impulse control she's talking about. So I think there's certainly progress being made. The final thing we've been talking about today is with regard to, well, how do we enforce laws? How do we gain compliance with laws? And here it's not only what Professor Van Roy was talking about, but also to tie it together with what some of the other speakers were talking about. I think one of the things to take from listening today is that both under-enforcement and over-enforcement of the law can really be a problem. Under-enforcement of the law can be a problem if we're dealing with children not making accusations of child abuse when child abuse really occurred. We're under-enforcing the law. Under-enforcement of the law can be a real problem if environmental laws aren't properly enforced, or food safety laws, to use Benjamin's example. But over-enforcement of the law can also be a problem if we're imprisoning people wrongly because of mistaken identifications and false memory. If we're punishing people too much, that's over-enforcement. And I think the question then is, how do we know what's the proper balance between over-enforcement and under-enforcement? And here, I wonder if Professor Ditto's research isn't crucial in telling us that ultimately it comes down to moral judgments that tell us what's over-enforcement versus under-enforcement, which then forces us to think about, well, which are the moral judgments that should be given a weight and which not, in deciding what's over and under-enforcement. And so as I listen to these presentations, I realize that what they've done is illuminate some of the most important problems in the criminal justice system and law more generally. And so if you haven't come to law school, if you get to come to law school, these are the things you'll get to focus on. Thank you.
Well, of course, it's very hard to follow Dean Chermerinsky, and I can't thank him enough for his thoughtful comments, for integrating this discussion for us, and for being here tonight. And I would normally open up the floor for questions and comments, but I am keeping you from a nice reception and wine that we have out there. And I thought if you would like, please join us out in the lobby area. We will be having wine, hors d'oeuvres, and we would love for you to join us and ask questions. Please come up to the speakers. But before we break, I do want to thank again the School of Social Ecology and the Newkirk Center for making this possible. And of course, the wine and the hors d'oeuvres is also to be thanked by them as well. So as we all take part and thank tonight. But also to thank all the speakers tonight for their amazing talks, for staying on time, and for being just the first showcase of our Psych and Law faculty. To let everybody know, in the fall, we will have 5 more speakers from our Center on Psychology and Law speaking, and we really do hope you will enjoy and join us, because we are starting to lift off the center. We want to really come and bridge with the community and help bring what we're doing here at UCI out into the community and out to you. So please join us for this reception, but thank you again, and thank you all for coming.